Thank you so much, Joanna, for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can see my PowerPoint all right. Just maximize it. So, on this occasion, as you may understand, it is not my place to thank the organization, but I would like to start by saluting my co-organizers and also all of those who are participating in this workshop and watching it. And as Joanna mentioned, my own contribution today deals with funerary contexts, and it stems from my research on Southern Portuguese Iron Age funerary contexts and practices, a subject which I have been paying more, which is a subject that I have been worked a lot, but which have led me to study textile tools and technology, a subject which I now have been paying more attention to as part of the Euroweb cost action. Now, to give you an idea of the data we work with, in Southern Portugal, there are references to the presence of textile tools in at least 45 sites, most hailing from domestic contexts, but also in some cases from religious or votive ones. But apart from those, we also know a certain number of examples retrieved in funerary settings, which will be the main focus of this presentation. We can in fact list 7 funerary sites in which textile tools have been documented, to which a possible 8th example could perhaps be added, as we will see. Chronologically, the earliest example of the incorporation of textile tools in funerary inventories is to be found in the necropolis of Alcácer do Sal, where a relatively large assemblage of spindle whorls has been retrieved. According to the testimony of Virgílio Correia, who excavated the site in the 1920s, these pieces, normally found in pairs, appear already in the tombs corresponding to the earliest phases of the necropolis, these 4th and 3rd type tombs, dating back to the late 7th and the early 6th centuries BCE. And they remain a part of funerary offerings at least until the 4th century BCE, as attested by their presence in late Iron Age tombs of Correia's first type. Other comparatively early examples can be found in the tumuli necropolis of the Lower Alentejo region, the clearest example being that of Herdade do Pego in Ourique. But unfortunately, we do not know the exact context in which the 6 spindle whorls and the 6 loom weights from this site were found. However, the general characteristics of the necropolis and its material culture suggest a date between the 6th and the 5th centuries BCE. The same can also be said about the single spindle whorl retrieved in Tomb 3 of the necropolis of Perdieiro in Odmira, unfortunately never published. Textile tools are also documented in the so-called P-shaped monuments, usually seen as the last and late expression of the regional tradition of tumular monuments, and more specifically in the necropolis of Atafona in Almodóvar, where a loom weight was documented accompanying an urn burial deposited outside the monument itself. By its typology and the material culture it housed, namely a painted ware imitation of a Greek crater, this assemblage can be dated to the early to mid 4th century BCE. There are also references to the find of spindle whorls in more recent excavations at the site, but these remain for the moment unpublished. In the same chronological bracket, we can also mention the assemblage of 10 spindle whorls retrieved in Tomb 1 of the necropolis of Quinta da Queimada in Lagos, the cremation burial of a female individual whose offerings also included 2 Greek platters which securely date the tomb. In Inner Alentejo, in a very different cultural context in which continental influences are felt more strongly, we find further examples of textile tools included in funerary inventories. The most significant example is that of Chaminé in Elvas, where the presence of spindle whorls was already known since the 1950s, having deserved special attention in Manuel Heleno's report on the site. More recently, Monica Rolo has inventoried a total of 38 spindle whorls, which, in light of the global chronology of the necropolis, can be dated to an interval centered in the 3rd century BCE. A date between the 4th and the 3rd centuries BCE also seems appropriate for the necropolis of Herdade das Casas in Redondo, in which an assemblage of spindle whorls, as of yet unpublished, has also been retrieved. Finally, we could possibly add to this list the single spindle whorl retrieved in the caves of Poço Velho in Cascais, which can be associated with the poorly known Iron Age occupation of this karstic system. However, it should be noted that the chronology of this piece is not absolutely clear, nor can the exact functional nature of this Iron Age occupation be considered indisputable, although some evidence seems to support funerary interpretation. So, summarizing the data which we can glimpse from these sites, textile tools are first incorporated in funerary inventories still during the early Iron Age, at some point between the late 7th and the first half of the 6th century BCE, and their presence in tombs extends at least until the 3rd century BCE, While naturally, during this long period of time, they appear in very different contexts with different cultural backgrounds and as part of different funerary practices. As for the documentation itself, we should note that spindle whorls are much more abundant than loom weights, a pattern we also find in domestic and votive contexts, and which can be explained by various, namely post-depositional factors. We should also point out that from a typological and decorative point of view, textile tools found in funerary contexts are virtually indistinguishable from those found in other sites and show no particular features which could eliminate their meaning in the funerary sphere. On the other hand, there are unfortunately no anthropological data for any of these necropolis so far, so we can't assess the specific identity of the individuals buried with these tools, which hinders our understanding of their role and significance in this specific domain. The only way to assess that significance is therefore through an exercise of comparison with other geographical and cultural areas, an exercise which on this occasion I will limit to the space of the Iberian Peninsula. In order to assess whether the practice of depositing textile tools in tombs stems from exogenous influences, we can start by looking for parallels in the Phoenician world, an exercise which, however, quickly leads us to conclude that there is a total absence of textile tools in the archaic Phoenician tombs of the Iberian Peninsula, as far as I could ascertain. We only find them in later Punic tombs, and then only sporadically, as shown by the 3 spindle whorls from the necropolis of Jardín in Vélez Málaga, the 4 loom weights and the single spindle whorl from Puente de Noy in Almuñécar, or the 8 loom weights, at least, from Puig des Molins in Ibiza. In the Greek sphere, on the other hand, and more specifically in the necropolis of Ampurias in northeast Spain, textile tools do not make an appearance in tombs until the late 3rd or even the early 2nd century BCE, in contexts likely relating to the Roman presence, so we can't glimpse too much information for our present discussion from this Greek site. In contrast, in contexts which we could qualify as indigenous, the incorporation of textile tools in funerary assemblages can be traced back to the Orientalizing period, as shown by the loom weights retrieved by Georges Ronsard in the necropolis of El Acebuchal in Carmona, the spindle whorls from the tumulus A of Setefilla in Hora del Rio, the spindle whorl from Cortijo de las Sombras in Fuciliana in Malaga, or the 2 spindle whorls from Les Casettes in Villajoyosa of Alicante. Most of these examples can be dated between the late 7th and the 6th century BCE and are therefore roughly contemporary with the earliest Portuguese examples I mentioned before. Despite these early examples, the peak in the presence of textile tools in funerary contexts takes place at a later stage of the Iron Age from the 5th century BCE on, a period in which such a presence can be traced in different cultural areas and contexts. Among these, the Iberian cultural area of the eastern and southeastern peninsula stands out, as textile tools and especially spindle whorls are virtually ubiquitous in its necropolis and sometimes form substantive assemblages. Although difficult to trace and not always sufficiently valued, the Iberian influence in the southwest, and specifically in southern Portugal, may have stimulated the practice of deposing textile tools in tombs. However, when considering the Portuguese context, the vectors of influence present in the sites mentioned above and their cultural affinities, it seems important to also look in other directions. We should therefore note that textile tools, and especially spindle whorls, are an equally current occurrence in South Iberian necropolis of the Inner Iberian Peninsula, with the assemblages from Carratiermes, La Junta, Arcóbriga, and Sigüenza, among others, forming expressive examples. The same can be said for the Vetonian cultural area of the Western Meseta, as testified by the significant spindle whorl assemblages from La Osera, Las Cogotas, or Raso de Candelera. Further north, in the Vacien cultural area of the Middle Douro, we find a similar scenario, with the most expressive example being perhaps the well-studied necropolis of Las Ruedas de Pintia. But beyond the mere observation of a certain cultural transversality of the practice under discussion, which inferences can we draw from the data available for these various cultural areas regarding the specific significance of textile tools in the Portuguese necropolis discussed above? Let's review the more likely interpretive hypotheses and confront them with this external evidence. The first and perhaps more evident interpretation of these materials would be to identify them as markers or even emblems of a feminine gender identity, in light of the overwhelming evidence for the association between textile activities and women. For the Iron Age of the Iberian Peninsula, there is, however, evidence which necessarily nuances the automatic association between textile tools and female burials. In fact, in the Iberian area, it has long been noted that a high number of contexts exist in which textile tools appear in close association with weaponry, which conversely were traditionally associated with masculine markers, or interpreted as masculine markers or emblems, which raises questions with regard to the exclusive association of either element to a specific sex. The growing but still limited number of available anthropological analyses seems to point in the same direction, as the systematic association of textile tools with both women and men has been documented both in the Iberian and South Iberian areas, a pattern which, however, and in light of what I said before, cannot be generalized to other geographic areas. Another interpretive hypothesis put forward, for example, by Margarita Gleba for Italian Iron Age contexts, relates the presence of large assemblages of tools with the identity of deceased as a specialized textile craftsperson. This hypothesis is naturally suggestive, and its applicability to Italic context seems very plausible, but its transposition to the context under consideration meets with some objections. To start with, large assemblages of textile tools are not the norm in the Iron Age of southern Portugal, where in most well-documented cases, each tomb contained only one or two spindle whorls. On the other hand, a wider analysis of textile production in the region seems to show a generalized image of small-scale domestic production, probably for self-consumption, which does not seem to leave much margin for any significant specialization. This hypothesis does not therefore seem to be easily applicable to the Portuguese material. We are therefore left with the hypothesis which has been put forward by several scholars and authors, including myself, according to which the inclusion of textile tools in this funerary context is the result of their magical, religious, or mythical significance in these cultural contexts. Several arguments, both internal and external, can be put forward in favor of this interpretation. From an internal point of view, we should note that in this broader geographical area, there is a well-documented presence of textile tools in cultic and votive spaces, as attested by the examples of El Carambolo in Seville, or Canchoruano and Castrejón de Capote, both in Badajoz, but also in some Portuguese contexts, which will be discussed later today. It should also be added that many of those tools, especially spindle whorls, were profusely decorated with astral or naturalistic symbols, which some authors have interpreted as evidence of the propitiatory use of these elements in connection with fertility and fecundity. On the other hand, from an external point of view, there are abundant examples from the ancient world to the ethnographic presence of a belief in the magical potence of the act of spinning, as illustrated by this passage from Pliny the Elder. The inventory of the multiple magical and religious connotations of textile activities, and particularly of spinning, goes far beyond the scope of this presentation, so I will just point here towards a series of works dealing with this subject. I will, however, focus on the recurring association between textile activities and notions of fate and destiny in what we could call the metaphor of destiny as thread. The most well-known and emblematic of these metaphors is embodied by the female deities of destiny represented as spinners, such as the Greek Moirai, the Roman Parcae, or the Norns of Nordic mythology. Several of the authors listed before do, however, list numerous other instances of this conceptual association between spinning and or weaving and destiny. Karen Beck Pedersen, in particular, working from Nordic literary sources, has looked into the reasons which make such metaphors so potent and cross-cultural, and she concluded that the ancient conception of fate as something which doesn't determine individual acts, but rather the nature of individuals, which necessarily shapes their actions, maps in very suggestive ways into the practice of weaving, in which the warp setup doesn't determine, but conditions the pattern of the weave, establishing certain parameters which the weft, despite its relative freedom, cannot escape. In this sense, and even if we have no other clear evidence, it seems at least plausible that the communities of the Iron Age Iberian Peninsula could have developed or adopted similar metaphors, which would explain why textile tools acquired a special significance with connection to the funerary sphere. So, to quickly summarize this brief exploration, we could say that the presence of textile tools in southern Portuguese Iron Age burials, documented from a relatively early period until the end of the Iron Age, could result from the magical or religious significance of such elements, plausibly in connection with notions of destiny, the exact nature of which still escape us. In light of the data presented here, those notions, which may be common to different geographical and cultural milieu within the Iberian Peninsula, seem to correspond to an essentially local development, although clearly in parallel with other areas of the Mediterranean and beyond. Textile tools in funerary settings should not therefore be taken at face value as reflections of gender identities or economic activities, but can represent an open window into the poorly understood worldview of the pre-Roman communities of the southern Portuguese territory. Thank you so much for your attention.